Dr. David Gussak is a board-certified registered art therapist and professor and chair of the Department of Art Education at the Florida State University, as well as the clinical coordinator for its graduate art therapy program. Prior to his appointment with the Florida State University, Dave was the director of our graduate art therapy program here at Emporia State University. Dave is a Hornet alum. He finished his PhD in the School of Library and Information Management in 2001. Dave has presented extensively, internationally, nationally, and regionally on forensic art therapy in forensic settings, and working with aggressive and violent clients. He has published extensively on various topics, but most significantly on art therapy within the forensic milieu. Several of his articles have been reprinted in Russian, Korean, and Slovakian publications. Dave is the co-editor and contributing author for the book Drawing Time, Art Therapy in Prisons and Other Correctional Settings, published in 1997, with Dr. Evelyn Versham, and Art Education for Social Justice in 2010, with Dr. Tom Anderson, Kara Hollemark, and Allison Paul. I note that 1997 because that shows that Dave's had a dedicated research area for over 15 years. So his involvement in forensic art therapy is long and deep and very creative. His first solo authored book was published by Columbia University Press just this past year. And to have a publication, to have a book published by Columbia University Press is recognition of the innovativeness of the kind of research that he's doing. The title of that book is Art on Trial, Art Therapy in Capital Murder Cases. And should you wish to purchase a copy, it is available over here after the lecture this evening. He is currently co-editing the Wiley-Blackwell Handbook of Art Therapy with Dr. Marcia Rosal. It is anticipated that this 85-plus chapter volume will be available in late 2015. Dave has served the art therapy field in many capacities for many, many years, including Director at Large on the Board of Directors for the American Art Therapy Association and Treasurer for the Art Therapy Credentials Board. He is currently on the editorial board for the American Art Therapy Association Journal and chair of the nominating committee. He is also guest editor for several other journals, including the International Journal of Offender Treatment and Criminology. And he's a blogger. He is the author of a featured blog for Psychology Today entitled Art on Trial, Confessions of a Serial Art Therapist. And it's the title of his blog that is also the title of this evening's lecture. There will be a question and answer session following the lecture. So please be thinking about questions. Would you please join me in welcoming Dave Gussak?
All right. Wow. That was a little frightening. Thank you. Hello. Hello. That's all I got. All right. Thank you so much for coming to this. And this was indeed the title of the blog, the Psychology Today blog. I have no idea what it means, but we're going to go with it. For those of you who are familiar with some of the work that I've done, I have done a lot of work in prisons and correctional settings. And I think for those of us who are in the fields, in these various fields, we understand the import of doing new research and finding out constantly the research and the new information. And just recently, I've discovered some really amazing information simply by tuning into the television. And what I found recently, I would like to pass on to you. Now, for years, I've been using this background. But just recently, I learned something, and I'm fascinated by this. So I'm going to pass it on to you. I've just discovered that this is not on. I've just discovered that. Is that right? Is that not working? Apparently we don't know what we've discovered. We've discovered absolutely nothing. Is that working? Fairly anticlimactic, isn't it? Does that work? I turned it on the side there. We should put a slide up there, technical difficulties. Hello. I could pantomime this. This is All right, how are we going to do this? Okay, show me my clicker. I'd like you to meet clicker. All right, does this work? None of this works. Should we just get batteries for this? All right, so let's start again. One thing that I've learned recently, something that I'd like to pass on to everybody, and please let's go to the next slide. I have discovered that this would have been a lot funnier if we went through, that orange is indeed the new black. And I think, thank you, that was the laugh I was looking for. I think that was worth the wait, don't you? Thank you, thank you. I'll be here all week. I will be. Of course, this will burn your retinas. So let's go back to the next. Let's go to the next slide. All right, we're going to go back to that. I would like to say that it is truly an honor to be back here tonight after all those years. It's been 14 years since I've been here, and to come here, I got here on Thursday, and to see the faces of the people that remind me of how much I enjoyed being here. I've got a chance to see Harvey again, and see Mark Childress, and see Libby. Of course, I see Libby every year, and I just love seeing her. And Jesse and Galen, what a wonderful art therapy program that they've carried on. It's incredible. And to see, and to say this sounds just unusual, Dean Ken Weaver. I bow to you, sir. So it's the Dean Weaver. He was the chair of the department that hired me. And the fact is, since then, I have become chair of the department. The fact that he's a dean and I'm now a chair, of course, as you know, calls into question the integrity of higher education. But still, I think that speaks highly of neither of us. But we also have Chair Brian Schrader, who I got to work with as a colleague, and that's just frightening in its own right. If that's my mother, I'm not here. So, but also I want to point out that I am a SLIM alum, and so we have the wonderful dean here from the SLIM program, and thank you so much for being here as representing SLIM. Thank you. And thank you for hosting this. It's wonderful. Now, the fact that I'm here to see all those wonderful people makes me long for being here. The nice thing is it's snowing out there, which makes me realize why I left. So, and that's important, I think, to remind me and make me feel better about the decisions in my life. So I will continue this. What I'm going to do, let's show the outline. The next slide is, and perhaps while we're doing this, let's go through each piece. The first one is, I'm going to speak a little bit about the introduction of art therapy and forensics, specifically the relationship between forensics and art therapy. Yeah, see if we can get those batteries. We can get arrested for battery here. I know, I feel bad, just as bad for that one. I am suspected of this. Let's try the next one. And I'll also be talking about a brief summary of the case that this is about. What I really like about this room is that I have a teleprompter. So I feel like right there I get to see it. I have a cheat sheet. This is so exciting. The provost is saying, yeah, I use it all the time. So it's excellent. The next thing I'll also be doing is I will be reviewing a great deal of the artwork. Let's look at the next bullet point. So I will be reviewing the artwork. And then after that I'll be presenting the results and the responses from the artwork as a review of what the artwork showed us for the case. And then I'm going to go ahead and follow that up with a discussion. And significantly, following that, I'm going to provide feedback, show you the feedback that I received from some of the attorneys, both the prosecuting attorneys and the defense attorneys, as well as the judge, who I interviewed following the case. So I'll be going into detail about that. So is that one working? Excellent. Oh, yes. I am once again in control. Excellent. Thank you. Which button here? The same thing? And I'm afraid I broke it last time. So, to discuss specifically, there is a difference between, basically, now for those of you, how many of you know what art therapy is? Okay, and what we know is that art therapy is for people named Art, right? And we're thinking of expanding it to include people named Drew and Clay. Thank you. And actually is, for those of you who don't know, art therapy is using the therapeutic use of art materials to either bring about therapeutic change to the process of art making, or using the end product as a catalyst for discussion, and in some cases using the product as a means to assess a person to see where they might be on their mental health or personality issues, or where they might be in their therapeutic trajectory. So art is the actual tool that we use in the therapeutic toolbox as an art therapist. Now, what is forensic art therapy? There is forensic art therapy, which is the investigative side of art therapy. It's where you use art and the accessible qualities of art to determine if there is evidence through the art. Oftentimes a forensic art therapist might be involved in child cases and abuse cases and court cases. I am not a forensic art therapist. I actually have spent many years. How many of you have been in prison? There, I'm glad you didn't fall for that. How many of you have worked in prison? Anybody in here? Excellent. Excellent. So you know that there's also, there is a therapeutic benefit for prison inmates, and oftentimes we will use art as intervention in the prison system. So that's art therapy in a forensic setting. So the difference is the forensic art therapy versus art therapy in forensic settings. I often will lecture about both. This evening I'm going to be talking about a specific case in which I provided forensic art therapy, and that is this death row murder trial. Okay? So I'm going to introduce you to the case and talk a little bit about the impetus of what led up to the case, the decisions that made me become part of this, and then what we did. So, let me introduce you to this. I was originally contacted in the fall of 2006, and I was asked by an attorney if I would be interested in assessing the artwork of a man who murdered someone. And my first response was no. I got this call from nobody I'd heard of, and they said, we understand you're an art therapist, would you be interested in providing some information, assessing the artwork of a person on trial for murder? And I said, no, I am not a forensic art therapist. If you want to speak to a forensic art therapist, there was an excellent one up in the New England area. Actually, she's in Pennsylvania. Her name's Marcia Succo-Liebman. She is the known forensic art therapist in the field. And they said, well, we contacted her. And she thought it would be a conflict of interest because she deals mostly with the victims. She works in child abuse law, child abuse cases, and we're dealing with a perpetrator. And so she thought that would be a conflict. She said, and this is how she worded it, she said, but if you're interested in working with someone who's comfortable with people who murder, contact Gusac. So that is a dubious honor, but I accepted it. And once you get that glowing review, you have to say yes. So I said, all right. So I would be interested in reviewing the artwork, and after I take a look at the art, we can go ahead and discuss whether or not there's something here that you can, I could use. Now, prior to this, I wasn't fully aware of the notion of art therapist as expert witness. But when I did some research after the case was over, I discovered that there were a number of art therapists that had written a great deal about art therapy as expert witnesses, specifically Marcia Succo-Liebman and Diane Safran. But that was mostly about expert witnesses in family courts, in abuse cases. There's no real references discovered about art therapy in criminal court or murder trials. However, again, it wasn't until after the case was over that when I started doing a little bit more research, I discovered that there were several art therapists that actually did provide art therapy in capital murder trials. And it was intriguing, and for those of you who are art therapists in the field or are training to become art therapists, some of these names might be familiar. If they're not familiar to you and you go into this program, come and see me. We do accept transfer students. So, wow, was that out loud? So, several of them are Myra Levick, who is the founder of the American Art Therapy Association. She testified on the art of someone on trial for murder and rape in Florida, but mostly the case that I became familiar with that she had done was she assessed the art of the daughter of a man on death row in Illinois, which was important mitigating information to determine whether or not this person should be put to death. There's also Maxine Young. She's considered the mother of art therapy on the West Coast. So for those of you who are familiar with the West Coast, I'm sorry. Sorry. How many of you are from the West Coast? Anybody? Okay, I'll talk slower. So then, I lived in California for many years, and that was the place to be. And that's how I got to know Max very well. And she is a wonderful art therapist who's still very, very active. There's also Sandra, and she provided expert witness testimony in California on a man convicted of murder, and this was after the case. And then there's Sandra Graves, who provided support for an appeal of a man on death row who was believed to be wrongly convicted. Both Sandra Graves and Myra Levick were successful in the appeals, and those people were not put to death. Maxine Young's defendant is still on death row. But as a side note, after the case was over, and I was doing research for the book, I had contacted these three art therapists after I'd heard that they were involved with this. And I asked if I could get some information from them. And all three of them had voiced disappointment that they never wrote about the case. So they said, well, we'll send you a little bit of information. All three of them said the same thing. We'll send you a little bit of information. And it never failed. All three of them sent me these file boxes filled with transcriptions and depositions and artwork. It was wonderful. I was ready to kill all three of them. And then I could go back and interview them afterwards. And it was remarkable. And I bring that up because those three cases were extremely entertaining. And I think that's the only way to say it. They were so exciting to read through. We turned that into a chapter, chapter 7 in the book, because of the differences between what they experienced and what I had experienced. And all four of the cases were extremely different from one another. So it was remarkable that art therapists can provide all sorts of different experiences for the court systems, in particular for murder trials. It is likely that there are other art therapists who have provided such services. I have yet to find any such documentation of such events. And what I would really like to see happen is if there are other art therapists that have been involved in such situations, that they actually write about it. So let's go back to the case. So my job was to assess the art, all right? So after initially agreeing to do so, they sent me a CD of the artwork. That was basically it. I knew that this person had murdered somebody, but I didn't know much more than that. I knew nothing about the art or the defendant. I knew that I now had a CD of poorly photographed artwork of well over 100 pieces. All I knew is that this person had done artwork for about 20 years. Many of the pieces were done prior to the murder, some immediately after, and some for a couple of sessions after that, a couple of years after that. Some of these pieces were done in the jail while he was awaiting trial. Now, what I needed to do, and I'll speak a little bit about this as we go on, is I needed to focus primarily on the formal elements rather than the content. Now, for many people out there who hear the notion of assessing artwork, they think that what we do is we read the art. They think that we look at the symbolic quality of the art and we're able to tell a story from the art. That's not what we do. In order for us to assess the art with empirical support, we actually look at the formal elements of how the drawing was done, not what was drawn. We're looking at the line quality. We're looking at the space on the page. We're looking at the prominence of colors. We're looking at the sketchiness of the lines. We're looking at the composition on the page. Is it fragmented? Is it cohesive? We're looking at the details of the actual elements of the drawing style. How many people in here have done artwork? I would think a lot of, excellent. So you understand when I talk about the formal elements, I'm talking about how the drawings were done, or how the paintings were done. And you can imagine that based on your mood or certain inhibitions or certain actions in a particular day, that the way you do a painting might be altered based on certain characteristics, certain moods. Those will change, and perhaps sometimes you can even tell by looking at those formal elements what you might be experiencing at that moment. Fair enough? So what we needed to do was focus primarily on the formal elements. So the initial reaction to the artwork was indeed, I suspected there was mental illness. What I thought at first, now this sounds much quicker than it is. This took several weeks to go through all the artwork, and I vacillated back and forth between various conclusions, and ultimately what I thought was that there might be some type of schizophrenia with indicators of depression. I also saw indications of other types of mood disorders or affective disorders. Now, for those of you out there who are in the psychological, how many of you are in the psychological field? Brian, don't raise your hand. How many of you, sorry, he's chair. How many of you are in the psychological field? So you know what's the combination of schizophrenia and affective disorder? Schizoaffective disorder, absolutely. Here's a side note, and I screwed up during the trial because I never said before the trial that he had a schizoaffective disorder. Why did I not do that? Because I'm an art therapist. I'm not allowed to diagnose. I can't come right out and say, diagnostically, he has a schizoaffective disorder. So what I would constantly say, up until the moment it mattered, that he had a type of schizophrenia with an indication of a mood disorder. And that's what I stuck with throughout most of my time until chapter 5. So, I had a brief phone conversation with the attorney. When I say brief phone conversation, I mean about an hour, hour and a half phone conversation with this attorney where we discussed all the art. And we went through every single image, what I saw and why. And she provided, at that point, an overview of the case. She then told me that the defendant was on death row for murdering the oldest child in the attempted murder of the youngest child. The defense believed that he had a mental illness. and therefore should not receive the death penalty. This was a state in which a mental illness would be a mitigating factor to prevent death. And these attorneys, the defense attorneys, were known as death row attorneys. I remember having a conversation afterwards asking the attorney, well, you keep saying you're death row attorneys. Is there a fancy title for that? Is there another way to describe that? She said, no, we're death row attorneys. And I didn't know there was such a thing, but their job was just to keep the defendant alive. And they believed that he had a mental illness. And therefore, the mitigating factors should prevent him from being put to death. So, okay. So at that point, now it was also very clever because I didn't have a lot of information beforehand, and it wasn't until I reviewed all the artwork and I came to the conclusion that he did have this severe mental illness that I agreed to do the case. Now, if they had come to me ahead of time and said, here's all this information, we believe that this person killed their child and the other child, and here's the information about the children, here's the information about the murder, I don't know what I would have said. But at this point, I'm now fascinated by the case. I'm now pulled into the case. So as a follow-up, I did indeed agree to testify on this case. So I did not hear from them again until spring 2007. Starts fall 2006. Did not hear again from them until 2007. So I still did not receive any other information regarding mental health status, what other witnesses indicated. I didn't even know who the other expert witnesses were. I hadn't spoken to them. I didn't know anything. I was told at this point that I would hear from them again as the court case neared. They did expect a slight delay. So a slight delay, spring 2007, I would get a slight delay. So I heard from them again in spring 2009. And for those of you who are in the law profession, how many of you are in the law profession? So you understand that 2007 to 2009 is not that long. Am I wrong? James is like, no, 2 years sounds about right. And in reality, what I found out was that during these 2 years, when I wasn't hearing from them, there was a lot of backstage negotiating that was going on. They had to determine whether or not I could even be an expert witness. I was going through what was known as a Daubert hearing to determine if the knowledge that I had, the education that I possessed, the experience I had, provided me enough scientific support to come to a conclusion that could be used in the court of law. All this was going through the backstage negotiating. I knew none of this was going on. All I knew was I hadn't been hearing from them for about 2.5 years. So I did hear from them in the spring of 2009. So I made plans to travel to the Midwest. I figured I needed to go out. I had to meet with the defendant and then assess him and then go to court. I'm going to let you in on a little bit of the end here of what happened. The plans changed due to a plea agreement. It turns out that when I was in Peru, of all places, I got an email that said, things have changed. A plea agreement has reached. Death is now off the table. But we still have to evaluate him because we now have to be concerned about the sentence. How long is the sentence going to be, and whether or not he deserves a full life sentence because of this crime. And the reason it was an ironic period of time, and I like to tell this little side story. The reason I was in Peru was because my 9-month-old son was adopting us. And he actually filled out all the paperwork. And I was a little afraid after he met us that he would turn us down, but he did like us, so he adopted us. And things change. When you're reading this case about a person who murders their child, and now you have a 10-month-old, you start to kind of re-examine situations. As an art therapist, as a clinician, as a person working in prisons for so long, you do learn to compartmentalize. You do learn to push your personal life away from your professional life. Still, there are moments where that gets to be a little difficult, and this was one of those moments. But I did get the email that there was a plea agreement. I did have a Skype conversation with them while I was in Peru. And I was told that I still was required to meet and assess the defendant in person. And I needed to provide a report for the sentencing hearing. So I was still going to meet with him. All right? So I made the plans anyway. About 3 weeks later, I flew to the Midwest, and I met the defendant. And I met with him for 5 hours in a county jail. We talked about his crime, his history, his art. Prior to talking, and I should reverse these, because prior to talking about all of his artwork, I did an assessment on him. And I did a formal assessment that's familiar in the art therapy field. It's the the formal elements art therapy scale, person picking an apple from a tree. And it's a very complicated process. It involves asking your client to draw a picture of a person picking an apple from a tree. And so he did that drawing, and we evaluated it using formal elements. And then I asked him to do one follow-up drawing, and he spontaneously did a third free drawing after that. So I had 3 drawings that I was able to assess at that present time, and then we reviewed all of his artwork for about 5 hours. Although he was clear and lucid at times, he exhibited grandiosity, mood changes, tangentiality, flight of ideas. To give you an idea of what this guy was like, he thought he was the second coming of Francis Bacon. He thought he was an amazing artist. And you know what? In a lot of ways he was. But he thought, now he knew I was there intellectually, he knew I was there to assess him to determine that he had a mental illness, that I was there to provide a defense. But on the other hand, he knew as an art therapist, I was there to tell him what a wonderful artist he was. Right? And he was grandiose in this, and that everything was about how wonderful he was. And so this happened. Now, granted, if I'm sitting in a small jail cell with an art therapist for 5 hours reviewing all of my artwork, I probably would have mood changes as well. If I sat with me for 5 hours, that's guaranteed. So I don't know how much we can take that into consideration, but the grandiosity, flight of ideas, and tangentiality was fairly telling for this gentleman. After I met with the defendant, the art was reviewed with the defense attorneys. And this was interesting. And again, after meeting with him for 5 hours, I met with the defense attorneys again for about 2 hours. And about partway into the conversation with the defense attorney, she said, wait. And she called in another attorney. She said, this is my partner in this case. And could you please explain to him what you're telling me? So I started reviewing all the artwork for him. It turns out later that he was extremely skeptical. He did not want an art therapist on board as a defense attorney. By the end of the conversation, I converted him. That was just in my head, sorry. But he, by the end of the conversation, asking lots of questions, he realized that perhaps not only should I write a report, but that he needed to go in front of the judge, because the judge needed to hear the specifics about what it was that we saw in the artwork. Now, what he did do during this conversation, during these couple of hours, was he would stop and ask me specific questions. And this is very important. And for all of those out there in the field who need to work with other fields, what I learned was we had to readapt our language. Because if you've been in the field for a long time, what we start to talk about becomes shorthand. We start to use terms that other people, other art therapists would understand what I'm saying. I mean, granted, Galen doesn't always understand what I'm saying, but when I talk about art therapy, she does, right? If I use shorthand. But here I was in this conversation with the attorneys using terms that he would say, wait, what does this mean, tangentiality? Can you point this out? What might that mean? What does fragmentation mean? What does color density mean? What does erratic line quality mean? And he would make me point it out. So what I learned just in that short period of time was how to readapt my language so that other people outside of my world can understand it. And that's extremely important for us. Because what ends up happening in any of our fields, that if we're in the same group for a long time, and we talk about things, and we talk about the wonders of the work that we do, it becomes almost magical thinking. We don't know how they got to the end. We just know that we're talking about the end. But if you talk to somebody and walk them through all the steps to how they got there, all of a sudden it makes sense. And it made sense for this attorney. And this attorney's like, we've got to put this person in front of the judge. Now, unfortunately, at that point, they said, but come with us. And they showed me this little closet, and they pulled out lots more artwork. That didn't make me too happy. So I spent another hour and a half taking lots of photos of the rest of the artwork and talking with them about it, knowing that if I'm going to do this again, testify, I'm going to have to meet with the defendant again to go over all this other artwork. So what ended up happening is the minute I decided to testify in the court of law, I had to be deposed by the prosecuting attorney. So I was deposed by the prosecuting attorney. Prior to the deposition, I met with the defendant again, was deposed. During that entire time, basically the prosecuting attorney, who, as you probably well guessed, the prosecuting attorney's job is to make me look like an idiot. And I don't know if you know this or not, my colleagues out there know, that's not that hard to do. But I had to figure out what he was doing, and I also had to figure out what I was presenting. And I had to determine what I was going to testify on and how much information I was going to give during the deposition. And then following the deposition, there was indeed a court hearing in front of the judge where there was an examination and a cross-examination by the prosecuting attorney. Now, what I'm going to get into now is, wait for it, the artwork. How many of you want to see the artwork? How many of you don't want to see it? Really? I figured they weren't hands on outside. Okay. Now, these are the things I would like you to look for when I'm showing you the art, because this is very specific, and I'll go over this again at the end. But when in terms of, I'm going to give away, again, part of the ending here. When you're looking for people with schizophrenia, there are certain characteristics or patterns in the art I want you to look for. I want you to look for fragmented imagery. I want you to look for chaotic, disorganized composition. I want you to look for floating figures, disconnected or omitted body parts, various inconsistent line quality, and inclusion of words and numbers. And I'll explain all that as we go along. For affective disorder, there's a constricted use of space, but there's also an expansive use of space in some of the images. A muted or heightened level of energy, muted or dark colors, and vibrant colors, and a lack of detail or too much detail. Now, I've divided up this slideshow between two sets. I'm going to show you all of the artwork that I showed in court. Of the 100 images, I only showed about 30 pieces of his artwork in court, which I thought was a representation of his entire body of work. And then following that, I have about 6 or 8 additional pieces that I haven't actually shown in public before, but have saved for this presentation. Now, here's the first piece. Okay. Now, it's a lovely piece. And I know some of you out there are thinking, that is a beautiful piece. And what this, and I showed this to the courts first, because I wanted to give the impression that A, he was a good artist. He knew what he was doing. But also, taken by itself, it doesn't reveal a great deal of information. But in conjunction with all of his other artwork, the patterns still remain. We have fragmented line quality. We have a fragmented composition in the back. We have, do you see this figure back here? It took me a while before I saw her or him. There's a figure blending into the background. We see erratic line quality throughout. Now, it could be because it's a painterly style, it's an artistic decision, or it could be for other reasons. And you'll see how this fits in amongst the patterns of all the other pieces. Now, and to be clear, I do think this is a beautiful art piece. So much so, this is actually the cover of the book. I figured I'll just throw off all the readers. More fun for me. So then I showed this piece, which was a page from what he called his visual journal. Now, what's remarkable about it is that these pages would be done all in one sitting. So he would do all this at once. You see different types of lines. You see faded figures. You see fragmented composition. These pieces don't seem to interact with each other. You see these little details, that little face in here. You see this head in here. For somebody who does a remarkable piece like this, to show this piece as an additional part of his portfolio shows a remarkable difference. And again, it's a visual journal page. It's all done at once. He did this piece here. Now, for those of us who have been in art school, we may have remembered doing pieces where we were asked to separate different portions in squares. We would do different details. Do you remember doing that? Right? And that's what I thought this was. That's why it's important to talk to your client. Because I asked him, did you do this in school? He said, I never went to school for art. I said, well, what's this for? He said, well, this, I wanted to fragment emotions. I wanted to show different emotions. And I said, okay, well, what emotions do we see here? And he called them pickup signs. These were pickup signs that he learned to look for to determine emotions. So I asked him specifically, what emotions is he revealing here? This he called windows, pungent, lips, eyes are different. These are emotions. Deadpan, little details. And those were the way he described emotions. The only word there that I may attribute to emotion was the word pungent, only because I have very emotional reactions to my mother's cooking. It's extremely pungent, very frightening, and I immediately had a visceral reaction. Otherwise, no other terms there had an emotional tie-in. This isn't going out there, is it? My mother's not going to see this, is she? All right. There's this piece here. where it's again a page done all at once. We see these unusual forms. It's almost as if he lost control here through this line. Now, it could have been deliberate bisection of the page with the scribble. He did describe this as a pathway. At first, to me, it looked like it was just something that lost control. Look for that again. You'll see that periodically in several of his drawings over the 20-year span. It wasn't as if he had his scribbling pathways period. This was a scribble that appeared several times throughout his art pieces. For example, well, this was, what do we see here? We see a floating head tethered to the ground with what he referred to as a tunnel. Okay, so you see fragmentation, you see disembodied body portions. What do you think this is? For those of you who were there Saturday, don't tell us. What is this? Good, thank you. It's a body part. It's a woman's torso, to be more specific, without a head, without feet, without hands. But when he first saw it, he first described it as a mountainscape. This was a mountainscape. And then later was able to tell me that it was reclining woman's form, but without the head, without the feet, without, well, there's probably a little bit of head and there. But you understand where I'm going with that piece. And there's almost an anthropomorphizing, I should say, let me step back from that, an objectification of the female form into a non-human landscape. We have this piece here called Mind Cage. And he said, quote, "That's how I felt. I'm the person inside the cage." This is what he said: "It's the art wanting to get out. Without the tools, skills, or to project it, I can see it but couldn't get it out." So for him, this was his mind that felt constrained, that he needed artwork to be able to get out what was constricting him. That was one of his more lucid explorations or explanations of his art piece. We have this piece here. And I showed this because all of these are wonderful forms. They're beautiful forms. And then you get to this, which was a church and an anthropomorphized woman. I turned the church into a woman. And then, of course, you have these floating eyes. We have this here. And this, he described this as a pathway again, with this face in it. Again, keep in mind, these were pages that were all done in this one sitting. We have a star and a little, I guess it's a little baby, and it says "Star Baby." And what that comes from is that he explained to me that his wife, that was a Freudian slip, wasn't it? You know what a Freudian slip is, right? It's when you say one thing and you mean a mother. All right. His wife used to say to him, "Well, you're a star baby." And I used to tell her, "No, I'm not a star baby. You just don't understand me." And that was a very interesting argument that he carried on with himself for a few moments before I grounded him again in the artwork. And this was his illustration. This was his illustration of what Star Baby was. He also has a word here, tired. That's important because you'll see words start to play a more important part in a lot of his pieces. This is also one of those instances where you can't just look at a slide of an image. You have to look at and talk with the defendant, and you also have to see the art in person. Because I saw this brick cage in the background, this brick wall in the background. It turned out that was on the other side of the sheet. So, yeah, a little foolish, but that's okay. So then we have this piece where the head or face starts to disintegrate. There's nothing really holding it together. Starts to break apart. And he writes, "Take me away, for I am nothing today." So there's a word, a sentence that he drops into the drawing. Here's one where we have this form, this anthropomorphized balloon or light bulb that's tethered by the scribble. And then we have all these little sketches all around it that are unrelated. And so we see some fragmentation, we see unconnected forms, right? And here's one I love to point this one out because it's so different from the others. A very heavy-handed composition, very controlled with uncontrolled scribbles in it. So at first glance, again, taken by itself, it's a beautiful composition. Taken in conjunction with all the other pieces as an additional piece for the pattern, you see similar scribbles throughout. You see the heavy-handed line quality, and it's really a well-done composition. And it's so striking in comparison to some of the others. This is where we have somebody who's walking into a pathway. He's walking into the other side. He did this one way before he entered jail. And this is one of my personal favorites. I know we're not supposed to have favorites, but this is a favorite. Because this is one of those pieces where if we wanted to write about the symbolic meaning of an art piece, we could write an entire chapter probably just on this one piece. You could write an entire book on the symbolism of his pieces. But it may not mean anything, right? And I'll explain a little bit more about that later. But what we have here is we have these machetes, we have this blood, we have the scribbling here, and we have this fire, we have this mandala. We have these faces here. Now, for somebody who could draw the faces as he did earlier, for him to draw something that starts to decompensate at this point, it's quite interesting. But you see the scribble starts here, works its way down here, and scribbles it all the way through here. Again, bisects the page. We have here, we start to see a little bit more in the unrelated words and notes with the composition that's a little erratic. We have the word help, law of flight, and this little face here, little figure here. We have the scribble running through here. So it starts up here, and this connection of this orange with this blue, and the scribbling here. Here, I don't know if you can tell what that is. That's Webb Hall. I don't know if you can tell. Sorry. Now what we have here is the statue of David with this woman drawn inside of it. Well done image. This is an example of how sometimes our shorthands will get us in trouble. Because for those of us in the art field, we know certain words, right? We know that if I was to say that this piece reminds us of Keith Haring and this reminds us of Art Spiegelman, some of us would know what we're talking about. It's shorthand, right? And when you're in a court case and you're being grilled by the attorneys, they're going like this. And sometimes, especially if you're being cross-examined, you don't have time to stop and think. So you revert back to what you know. You revert back to shorthand. And here I was saying, well, we have a Spiegelman-like quality and a Haring-like quality. And you have to pull back and say, well, wait. What we have are different compositions of cartoon-like figures that are unrelated. We have this word that doesn't seem to make sense at all here, ribs, and heart with this labeled horse. Now this I just attribute to him testing out colors that weren't used on the form. I want you to pay attention to this little figure right here. He's going to become my little mascot. Actually, I think I'm going to get business cards made up. He's going to become my logo. He's very important to me. And the reason he's so important to me, as a matter of fact, let's show you him. There he is. Say hi. Somebody back there is like, hi, thank you. I appreciate that. This is important because, and this happened after the case. I did not show this in court. But what happened was I had gone to American Art Therapy Association conference back in 2010, where I was finally allowed to show this artwork, and I'll explain why at this point. I was allowed to show this artwork, and I showed this to a room of art therapists. So there were about 200 people that attended this talk, and an art therapist came up to me just before the business meeting, because that's when you want to come up to somebody, just before a business meeting, and say, so tell me, did the defendant murder in a personal way? And I said, well, it was murder. I would assume it was personal. And she said, no, that's not what I mean. She said, did he murder in a manner that required close proximity? In other words, did he have to hold on to the person and kill that way? And I said, well, I don't like to talk about how he did the murders. It's fairly heinous and quite gruesome and frightening. But yeah, short answer is yes. She says, I knew it. And she pulled out this little drawing that she did during my presentation, and it was this figure. And she said, see, I could tell from this figure that that's what happened. Now, okay, I'm going to give that to her. It's a well-respected figure in the field. I'm close colleagues with her. I think the world of her work. She's written books in her own right. But with all due respect to her, so what? Right? And the reason I say that, this is the difference between evaluating the art through its formal elements or for the content or symbolic quality. Because it's unnecessary what she thinks this means. We know how the murder was committed. This wasn't a detective game. This wasn't us trying to figure out how he did a murder. We already knew how he did it. What's more is we may be able to look at the drawings as a whole and symbolically, if you were just using symbolic imagery, determine that he has a mental illness. But we're not going to know what kind of mental illness. We're not looking to see how he murdered. We're looking to see what was affecting him that created or caused him to murder. Does that make sense? And I think this is the best way that illustrates it, is this little logo of mine. Can I copyright? I don't think I can. Is there an attorney in here? James, can I copyright? All right, here's one. And I love this piece because he became quite tangential when talking about this piece. This is one of those times where you demonstrate that the artwork is a real grounding mechanism for the people we're working with. And when I was talking with him, he would often go off in tangents, and I would use the art to bring him back and refocus. And when he was talking about this piece, and he looks at this entire composition, he says, I love the piano. And when you're looking at it this big, you don't quite know what he means. So looking at it this big, you can see what he focused on was this little thing right here, was a little Liberace piano. I'm going to assume it was Liberace, because his wishes brother George was here. I can't do a Liberace. Anybody out there can do a Liberace impression? Not even after watching the Matt Damon film? You can't do it? All right. But the whole notion was at this point, he says, this is what he focused on with this drawing, is I like to play piano. Nothing else in here mattered to him. It was this little figure here. We have all these other elements. We have piano keys, we have drums, we have two burning stacks. I don't quite know what kind of stacks they are. I don't know if they're twin towers. I don't know if they're smokestacks. And we have these unusual compositions in here with this little Russian sickle. See that? Right. So, now do you know what this is? Anybody? An hourglass. That's what it looks like. Absolutely. But it's not. When he described it to me, it's a woman's torso. Right? So again, it's minimizing the woman's form and objectifying it in a manner that's almost unrecognizable. Right? So he reduces it and depicts the woman's torso in very muted form. We have this piece here, which to see this in person is quite impressive. This is a lot of oil pastel layered on top of one another. It took a great deal of energy to do this piece. A lot was focused in on this. He likened this to Georgia O'Keeffe, and I could see how he would do so. Then there's this piece, and I love, this was a little drawing of a friend of his that he did this little face. You can see how well he draws. He starts to draw the tie, and then he loses control, and he scribbles through the rest of the page. Very similar to the scribbles that we see elsewhere, but here it's so much more prolific. We see it so much more clearly as almost a way of him losing control during the drawing. Now, there were many drawings like this, but this was the drawing that I built up to demonstrate how he would lose control. Now, I want you to do this. Compare this piece to this piece. Great deal of energy. It's layered. We see, he also indicated that somewhere in here was another drawing of his friend. Underneath the layers, we have a pair of women's breasts here. We have other women's forms that he then piled on top of itself and created layers. And for those of us who have worked with clients with schizophrenia, oftentimes we'll see people layer on top of itself, almost as if to hide what's underneath. And he did have a tendency to create many layered drawings. This is one of the paintings. All right? And this was one of the pieces, I have to say, this one was quite shocking, this next piece. And I didn't see this until I went back to that little closet where I met with the defense attorneys. They said, we have more art. And they pulled out of the drawer this form here. And it's life-size. And you have to tell you, at first glance, when I saw this, like, okay, do I know this person? It turned out that this is a mannequin that he staked down in his front lawn. And his idea was to let this decompensate, basically, what's the word? Decompose, that was the word, eventually over time. It was a performance piece by a mannequin. And the police were just as frightened as I was when they pulled it out to see this body form staked down in his front yard until they got closer and realized that it was a mannequin. And they kept this, I don't know if they did this deliberately, but they kept it in this box, almost as if it was a coffin when they pulled it out of the drawer. I will say that many of these pieces went back to the defendant's mother. I don't think she took that one. I don't know, maybe she did. I showed this piece here. The reason I show this is not just because of this composition, but because of this little form here. And you can tell for those of us in the audience because of how big it's blown up, but in person, it takes a little while to realize that he uses words to make up the forms here. He uses letters, symbols, and forms. Again, what happens is sometimes when we start to see words on a page that are unrelated, or words in an art piece, we see what could be called a visual word salad. For those of us who work with clients with some levels of schizophrenia, oftentimes they speak in word salad where there are unrelated terms and concepts that don't seem to make a whole lot of sense when they're saying it. We see the same thing in artwork. Now, I show this to you because this was how it was first brought to me. It was 36 by 48. It was about 36 inches long. They gave it to me rolled up, and when they unrolled it like this. And this was filled with all of these words. Now, here's an example of the difference between defense attorneys and book publishers. Believe it or not, defense attorneys are much nicer than book publishers. And here's an example, because it was just enough that I could say to the defense attorneys, and in court, it was just enough to say that these are a lot of terms that are strung together that don't make sense. That was enough for them. The publisher said, we want you to translate this. And they made me, and it's in the book, it's in the center of the book, where one page is this, and the opposite page is the translation of what all this says. And when you translate it, none of the concepts mean anything. So we either have somebody with mental illness, or we have a beat poet. I don't know. Kind of catchy. I think we could set it to Pink Floyd music. That would be kind of cool. This is why I have no friends. Here's another piece here, similar, with a lot of words. They also made me translate this as well. So you have a lot of statements in here that don't seem to really connect with one another. And it's almost like he was driven to write this on the page, across the page, right? Okay, here's an image of the layers I was talking about. From blown up this large, you can see it clearly. But in person, it's a little bit more difficult to see that there are layers upon layers in here. This was done after he was in jail. He used jailhouse materials for this. He used coffee, he used ink, he used toothpaste for texture. It's actually a beautiful piece. And for those of you who have been in prison before or worked there, you'll find that they will find anything to make art. And I've found some of the most creative pieces by people who have used things like toothpaste or soap. And what's nice, it still smells minty fresh. Now, I talked a little bit about the formal elements art therapy scale and the assessments I gave. This was done now. At the end of this period, I'm now seeing him in 2006. He does the drawing of a person picking an apple from a tree. Now, I have, in my research in art therapy in prisons, I did a great deal of research about art therapy in correctional settings. I have collected hundreds upon hundreds of these drawings, and to assess the inmates that I work with. I have never seen anybody do what he did. And he took the page. I had just spoke with him for about 20 minutes, 30 minutes to find out more about his history. He took the piece of paper and he crumpled it up and he smoothed it out. And he crumpled it up again and he smoothed it out. And then he took these magic markers and he started sketching. Sketching like that. And then he would dip his finger in the water, his little water cup, and he'd smear pen ink with water as if it would smear. For somebody who's familiar with our materials, we know that magic marker doesn't smear when you add water to it. And that's where you have some of this right here. It was the most interesting thing I had ever seen. On top of that, from a diagnostic criteria, we do see, well, we don't really see yet levels of schizophrenia. We see, because in order for the schizophrenia to exist in a drawing, it's not just one element that stands out. It needs to be a pattern of several elements combined, which will create an overall diagnostic image. Fair enough? But what we have here are enough patterned elements to demonstrate that he does have an affective issue. We see a lack of environment. We see a lack of details. We see 50% of the page is used, so it's not that bad. But the line quality is somewhat erratic. It's a very interesting drawing, and in and of itself, it's an interesting drawing. As a diagnostic tool, it certainly demonstrates perhaps an affective issue, perhaps depression. Then I gave him an array of materials, and I said, now I'd like you to do a free drawing. He did this. This was the free drawing that he did for me in 2006. Very similar to the compositions that he had been doing all those other years for the past 20 years. We have the headless horse here, apparently a Godfather fan. Really? No Godfather fans out there? Thank you for that. Leave the drawing, take the cannolis. Very good. Excellent. We see this form of a woman here whose breasts are somewhat incomplete. We have this floating head. We have these symbols that are kind of floating around out here. Right? And then we have the scribble line through here. Then, without preamble, he takes another sheet of paper, without prompting, he does this piece. Now this piece is significant. He took chalk and oil pastels, he started this vertically, and he did this right here. And at first, it was the woman's torso that we saw from the drawing way before. And then it became a mountainscape, and then he turned it on its side and finished it horizontally, adding this figure here with a single breast, and created layers covering everything. And his need and tendency to cover everything was almost visceral. So it was an impressive presentation of his actual drawing style. So what we saw here, and this is the artwork that I testified on in court. I'm going to show you a few additional images, just for the fun of it. We recognize this piece. I think this was used for the flyer. This is a much more thought out horse. The body torso with by itself is a beautiful image, but taken in patterns with all the other pieces does give us a lot of information. We see this horse here, we see this thorny branch here. It's a beautiful composition, but in conjunction with all the other patterns that we see, it gives us some more information about mental illness. He also liked to do photography. Now, I didn't show the photography in court, because if I showed this piece, I may have had to show other pieces. And some of the other pieces also had family members in them, and I did not want to show those in court. Right? And I'm always intrigued by this, that he managed to make it so that the shadow of this little figure here, which is here, was posed with this, so it looks like he's choking the figure. A little disturbing. You see this piece here? See the face in here? Very fragmented. We also see how it's incomplete because he had other sketches around it. A little lion's head, a little person's head, a little figure here. We see a little fish here. I think it's a fish. It might be manatee. I don't know. It could be manatee. And all these little images in here. It's a beautiful image. But it's in conjunction with all the others, it gives us some more information as a support. You see this? He liked to do collages. And this is all about medication, which, by the way, he had never been on. So he had all these years of a mental illness, and he had never been on medication. It's not to say he didn't self-medicate. He did indeed self-medicate with a variety of different drugs, but he never took meds. And this was a piece that originally I thought was a self-portrait before I met him, and realized it wasn't. But it was a well-detailed piece that he did years later while he was in jail, using a ballpoint pen. And I show it just because I'm intrigued by the composition itself. So, these were the pieces that I showed in court, right? And I had to state very clearly in court that I'm not qualified as an art therapist to diagnose, but I can assess based on the elements of the artwork. I had to be very clear what my limitations were. And so I attempted to demonstrate through lengthy review of all art pieces that they reflected a schizoaffective disorder. I'm going to give you a little story here, and those of you who were here on Saturday didn't hear it. So all of you get to hear the story. And I write about this in detail in the book because it is clearly the time when the defense attorneys made me look like an idiot. And I want to share it with you because I like looking like an idiot. So I'm going to tell you what happened. The entire time that I'm working on this case, I was very careful about not diagnosing. I would say he had schizophrenia with possible mood disorder. Every time, schizophrenia, possible mood disorder. That was my mantra. I was going to make bumper stickers to slap it on my car that said that. I had it down. I was there. And then I get to court, and what do I say in court? Schizoaffective disorder. And what happens? The prosecuting attorney hears that, and he jumps on it. Why does he jump on it so hard? Because he now has something to prove. Because what we found out was that the psychologist and psychiatrist who testified earlier in that week on his mental state indicated he had a schizoaffective disorder. Now, this is the first time that the prosecuting attorney is hearing me say schizoaffective disorder. He actually said, he held up the deposition during the cross-examination, and he said, "Excuse me, Dr. Gusac, where in this deposition do you ever use this term schizoaffective disorder?" And at that point I realized, I'm an idiot. And I said, "I didn't, but no. Is there any place in this deposition where you say he had a schizoaffective disorder?" And what he was trying to demonstrate was that I collaborated with the other expert witnesses. You know what's funny? That's actually the ring for my wife. And I knew it. I knew she's trying to reach me. It's that alarm. They thought I was trying to collaborate with the other expert witnesses, that we were setting up the defense. That by me coming out and saying it was schizoaffective disorder, I had talked to these people. I never knew what they had said. I never spoke with them. I screwed up. So it was then the turn of the defense attorney who stood up and said, during the recross, and said, "Excuse me, Dr. Gussak, what exactly did you say in the deposition? What kind of diagnosis did you think he had?" And I said, "I believe he had schizophrenia." And she said, "To be sure, on page 42, please turn to page 42 of the deposition, what do you say?" And I quoted it. "I believe he has schizophrenia." "And what does it say on page 76 of your deposition?" And I said, "I believe he has an affective disorder." And she said, "And understanding the DSM the way you do, what is the definition of schizophrenia with the mood disorder?" And she said, "Schizoaffective disorder." She goes, "I rest my case. Thank you." Oh, I was so happy. So they were like, "Okay, we're back on track." She helped me out. I didn't look quite as stupid as I did before. Still look stupid, not quite as stupid. So the whole point was, and the strength of this entire case, was that as an art therapist, I was able to demonstrate through the art that, along with the psychologist and psychiatrist, he had a schizoaffective disorder. Now here's the difference. The psychiatrist and psychologists were able to evaluate him at that time, at the time of the murder and shortly thereafter. The artwork can demonstrate a long record of the same patterns that existed for 20 years. So we were able to demonstrate that not only did he have it, perhaps right after the murder, but he also had it for 20 years leading up to the murder. And that's what was important about the art. Make sense? Yay. Okay. So, he did indeed receive his prison sentence, and the judge indicated that it was likely, based on the testimonies, that the defendant had a mental illness. Based on the circumstances, the defendant would receive the following sentence: 60 years for the murder of his oldest child, 35 years for the attempted murder of his youngest, to be run concurrently, consecutively. So he's in jail for 95 years. The defense saw this as a success. He is not on death row. Technically, he's not up for life, which means technically he could go up for parole in a certain amount of time. But they met their burden, and more importantly, the judge recommended that the defendant receive mental health treatment in prison, and that was extremely important. I want to go over this, in summary, the diagnostic criteria real fast, and then I'm going to show you a few of the statements made by the team, the attorneys and the judge afterwards. All right? So schizophrenia, of course, I wanted to point out, that's very fast. Fragmented imagery, chaotic, floating figures, disconnected omitted body parts, various inconsistent line quality, and inclusion of words and numbers. Mood affect disorder includes constricted use of space, expansive use of space, muted heightened levels of energy, muted or dark colors or vibrant colors, lack of detail, too much detail. Right? After the fact. Now, the book, keep in mind, I had no intention of writing a book. Right? What I was going to do was write an article. And here's the other piece of it. Originally, the contract, this is important to note for personal ethical issues and moral issues. When they first approached me and after they gave me the disc, they sent me a contract that I would testify and I would be an expert witness. And they said in the contract, you are not allowed to talk about this case, ever. You keep it to yourself. And I said, I can't do that. I teach. I'm an academic. We can't shut up. You have to let me use this. She said, oh, let me check with the team. And they came back, they went to the judge, and they came back with a new contract. And the contract said, you are allowed to talk about this and use this information after the defense is over, after the sentence is given. So I am now given permission to write about this. And it was just going to be a book chapter, just a book chapter. Because I had never done any of this before. It's either going to be an article or a book chapter from Mark Gertz's book on criminology. And then it grew, and it kept growing until it finally became a book. And then I realized in order to substantiate some of the information in this book, we needed to go back. And for those of you who are interested in qualitative research, and for those, and I got this from my SLIM PhD, because I learned how to do real robust research at SLIM, because they won't let you get out without that. And so what I needed to do is I needed to go back and substantiate the information that I developed, to see what they thought after the fact. So I got permission and I went back and I interviewed the prosecuting attorney, the defense attorneys, the judge. I went back and interviewed the other art therapists and gathered all their data. And these are some of the things that they had said afterwards about the case. So I talked to Lisa Peters. These are not their real names. She's a defense attorney associate. Jackie Chief, defense attorney. Bill Williams, chief deputy prosecutor. I use that name just because it sounds silly, and he's the prosecuting attorney. And the Honorable Judge D. Beam, Judge Circuit Court. So, Lisa Peters indicated, art-based assessments can really help tell the story because we're such a visual culture. I think it's a very effective communication tool. The art doesn't lie even if the defendant does. We could use this. We knew that sometimes, and I say this to all the time when I'm talking about the art therapy in prison, and I say this, do sometimes our inmates lie? Yeah. Sometimes do the inmates tell the truth, though? Yeah. But we don't know when. So sometimes they lie, sometimes they don't, but the art doesn't lie. If we use it correctly, it gives us the right information. The other piece of information that Lisa and I talked about a lot was how important it was to use the art to tell a narrative. Because when you tell the story of the defendant, all of a sudden they become human. And when you see the artwork of the defendant, they become human. They're no longer objectified. They're no longer seen as the monster that the prosecution wants them to be. Did he do heinous crimes? Yes. Did he deserve a prison sentence? Yes. Did he have a mental illness? Yes. And did he have his own story? Yes. And the artwork tells that story, and it gives him a human image. That's why the defense likes it. The prosecution would like it for a whole other series of reasons. Jackie Chief, she was wonderful. She was an attorney's attorney. She was incredible. She has been a death row attorney for many years. I asked her how many trials had she tried, and she had defended 28 death row inmates, and how many of them had she won? All 28. She stands this tall, and she can take me in a fair fight. The art therapist's testimony confirmed the diagnosis that we had already received from our other mental health experts. Now, people think that's amazing, right? People think that's miraculous. It's not miraculous. I'll tell you why it's not. All right, so I'm going to give myself away a little bit here. Because back in 2006, if during the conversation I had said anything else, if I had said that he had a dissociative disorder, if I had said that he had merely depression, if I had said that he had a gangrene toenail, they would not have contracted for my services. But because I said what they wanted to hear, because I could verify what the other defense team members indicated, they were going to use my testimony. I didn't know this during the time. It was not until later that I realized that this was the case. But most importantly, the art therapy testimony corroborated, or I'm sorry, strike that from the record, collaborated, or corroborated, it agreed with the others. All right? Sorry, rented lips. I think the testimony was very helpful in allowing the judge to understand more about the client and why he acted the way he did. It was an illustration, all right? And not only a mere picture, it was hundreds of pictures. And you put 100 pictures together, you have a flip book. And a flip book gives you a movie of this person's life, right? Being able to look at a lot of different pieces and show recurring things over an extended period of time was very helpful. I'll take that. I'm sure she could have been a bit more glowing, perhaps. Helpful is good. Bill Williams comments, this is the prosecuting attorney. Remember him? Guy who made me look like an idiot? This is what he said. And he was by far the most helpful. He was extremely helpful. The reason I wrote the book was it was his fault. We were joking around during the deposition. He says, when can we expect to see this in writing? I said, I'll let you know. And when I emailed him and I reminded him of that conversation and said, would you be willing to interview? He said, I will most certainly be willing to interview because I think this should be in writing. There needs to be more of this information out there. What he said was, art therapy was a brand new concept to me. I'm sure we've all heard that before. I did ask with some skepticism how you can use these tools, particularly the apple tree drawing task for the diagnostic process. Williams was skeptical about the assessment of artwork created prior to the crime. You convinced me that there is some legitimacy of using art therapy as a diagnostic tool for that point in time. The fact is, I had 20 years worth of that point in time. And that's what was important, and that's what he agreed to. The judge, since the experience determined it can be a viable tool, it was helpful in a corroborative sense, again, glowing words. Admitted, I love this, admitted it was helpful to the defense rather than unnecessary, which, by the way, since then, I have put that in my resume. I am no longer unnecessary. So, and I take that with pride, because my wife still argues that. Anyway. Hope she's not watching. The gravitas of the case, a capital case, would have made it more likely for the testimony and the role of an art therapist as expert witness be allowed upon a downward challenge. In general, the courts may afford more leeway for the defense in a capital case than another type of case. It was a perfect storm of events that allowed this to happen, because we happened to get a judge that said, sometimes you have to give a little bit more leeway in a death murder trial, or capital murder trial, and because you were in this court, we gave a little bit more leeway, we were willing to hear you out, and yes, it worked. We recognized that he had a mental illness because of the 3 expert witness testimonies. Okay? Those are the interviews that I had. I would like to acknowledge the help of my research assistant, Nicole Hoffman, who did a great deal of work in helping me with this. I would like to thank the defense attorneys, who did a great deal of help. Even the prosecuting attorney, who helped me with the book process afterwards. The honorable judge for the circuit court, and are there any questions? And thought I would get away from the orange. At this point, yes, James. I thought you told him not to ask any questions. Sorry.
Going back to the person in Pennsylvania that suggested you said that she didn't think she could be objective. Do you feel the same way now? And do you realize that you'd be more credible in future cases if you worked both sides? So that
Yes.
you can't be labeled as always working for one side and always working for the other.
I think that's an excellent question. Thank you for asking that. Because I wanted to point something out that allowed me to deal with the case as it was anyway. Because the notion, there's several points to this. One is the notion of, yes, I think I would be a lot more credible if I worked both sides. Because I could, but it depends if I believe in what both sides are doing. In this particular case, there's no such thing, and I don't know, and I always knew this, and then I read it, and it was verified. So obviously, if it was written down, it must be true. But there's no such thing as an objective expert witness. Because the truth of the matter is, as an expert witness, I am still contracted by a particular side. And that particular side expects me to do the best that I can for that side. And so no matter what I say, I'm not objective. I'm going to be as perfectly clear and direct and objective in the information I'm giving, but I really do want the side to win whose side I'm on. And and that means I have to believe in what I'm testifying on, which is where the rub comes in. During this entire time, I made it very clear to the defense, I made it very clear to the judge, I made it very clear to the prosecutor. I am not testifying for or against the defendant. Call it semantic gymnastics, if you will. But I indicated from the very beginning, I am testifying on the art, nothing else. It's not my position to determine whether or not the defendant was guilty or innocent or not guilty by reason of insanity. It wasn't my position to determine whether or not he should get the death penalty. That wasn't the place to argue this case. What was the position was that I could only testify on the art, and it allowed me to sleep at night to say that. Now, in this particular situation, would Marcia Sucon Lehman have learned a great deal more if she had testified on the murders? I don't know. I would like to think that she would, but I can also understand her reluctance to do so. And that is her, as she is as a person and as a therapist. As much as I see the value in testifying, both for the defendant and for the victims, as well as testifying for both the prosecuting and defendant to learn all parts, not everybody can do that. Excellent question. Thank you, James. Yes? You want me to come down there? You want me to stay up here? I stay up here. You stay up there.
Hi.
Hi.
So my question is, while you were going through this process, how did it affect your own artwork, or does it still affect your own artwork?
Well, everything I do affects my artwork. I'd like to be a good art therapist and indicate that I do a lot on my own artwork. Time sometimes prevents that from doing so. But I did do some paintings during that time. I found myself having to become a lot more meticulous in my paintings, a lot more control in my paintings, because really that's where I kind of needed the control. So I did several paintings that were very structured, which is usually like my style. I also, however, during this time did a lot of large community murals with the program department out in the city, and I got to work on really large walls with community kids, with community systems. And so it allowed me to interact with real people instead of being cooped up in this case all the time. And so my art allowed a release. I wish I did more. Believe it or not, it was the actual writing that was more therapeutic during this entire process, by being able to write about it and get it out. And this is something, by the way, for those of you who are at all familiar with my research and my work, and if I've ever edited anything that you've ever written, I'm against, to a certain extent, writing in the first person. I don't like, ask Libby, she'll tell you. I don't like when people write in the first person because you can't generalize it. You can't use that information and internalize it for yourself. It's that much more difficult. But when I wrote this, chapters 1 through 5 are not only written in the first person, they're a complete narrative. However, it was the strength in those 5 chapters, the reason that Columbia University picked it up. They said, and I don't know quite how to take this, they said when they read that, when the editorial team read the manuscript, they said chapters 1 through 5 read like an NCI episode, which is why they wanted it, which is, I guess that's fine. I never really watched NCI. I don't know how to spell NCI. So I said, that's what I meant to do. So I wrote it as a narrative, almost as if I was journaling the whole process, but in a much more structured, controlled, research focus. Does that make sense? It allowed me to get it out. So you're reading my own therapy. Over here, and then we're going to come back here. Yes?
The photograph that you, that the artist put on, was that, was that?
What? No, I'm kidding. Sorry. That's for the...
The photograph that you showed,
Uh-huh.
Did the artist tell you that mannequin, the drawing mannequin, was that choking, or was that just something that you kind of picked up?
He didn't, he was, by the time I got to that photo, actually, this isn't going to work. You all remember the piece, right? Where this is blinding too, isn't it? I think that's the end of the show. All right, short answer is no. Because by the time we got to that, it was fairly tangential. I wasn't going to let out clear information. He was talking about how much he enjoyed photography, but he was very vague on what the intention of the image was. And remember, these are pieces that he had done 10 years before, 5 years before. These are pieces, that actually is a great question, because it reminds me to point out that one of the benefits, thank you very much. It reminds me to point out that one of the benefits also about looking at the formal elements is that you can't necessarily filter the symbolic content through him 20 years later. The filter is clogged with time and with his own current mental stability. And so I may not be getting a clear history of what these symbols might mean. I could put as much meaning onto this piece as I want. It doesn't mean anything. So no, he didn't tell me what this meant, and nor do I think he would have been accurate in telling me what it meant. But in reality, when I say that this is what it looks like, I have to be very clear and objective in saying this is what it appears to be, and qualify all statements that I make about the piece. That's a great question. Thank you. We had a question back here? Yes, sir.
For anyone who is interested in this field, could you give advice on how you dealt with being with this man? If I were in a room with somebody that did such heinous crimes, I don't know if I could stand myself. I might need to go home and take a shower.
Oh, I did.
How could you give some kind of advice, some kind of direction on how they could compartmentalize themselves?
Oh, that's a really good question. And to give advice to people who are becoming therapists on where they could work is really to know your own limitations and what you could work with. There are populations that I just would not feel comfortable working with, and I made it a point not to work with those populations because I wouldn't do them any good if I'm not comfortable with them. I had spent many years working in prison, so I was comfortable with being in the same room with such people who did heinous crimes. We have to learn, our therapists especially have to learn to a certain extent how to compartmentalize, because not only do we run the danger of going home with the work that we've done, we also run the danger of looking at every single piece as being pathological. I'm not saying that they're not, but and that's not the case, obviously. All art is wonderful, and actually we probably compartmentalize the other way, because all work for us is wonderful expressions. And every piece we see here, as heinous as it may represent, they're wonderful art pieces, and they're wonderful expressions of who he was. Having said that, the only advice I can give is that people have to have a strong enough sense of self, sense of ego, to know what they're capable of handling, to understand and be able to work within their own countertransference that they may respond in. There has been a couple of clients in the past that I just can't work with because of my own countertransference. And you know, sometimes it may not be countertransference, you just may not like the guy, and that's okay too. So it really is a matter of what we're comfortable with. And knowing that, that's the field you shoot for. Why? I mean, my entire career is built on working with aggressive and violent clients, prison inmates, jail inmates, graduate students, all of them. So I know, you know, these are just what I can handle. You know, call it an extended family reunion for me, you know. Excellent question, though. And then I would recommend is, Galen has a wonderful 2-year program here at the Graduate Art Therapy Program, so you may want to check it out. Do I get a kickback on that one? Score. All right. What are the questions? Yes?
So for the first painting that you used for the book title,
Yeah.
or the book cover,
Yeah.
is it typical for people who have psychotic disorders to use like a negative space to
No.
create the image?
No, and I'm glad you're pointing that out, because again, I want to reiterate, and this is the danger we sometimes run in with looking at these types of drawings, is that we start to second guess what our own artwork contains because of the artwork we may see in somebody who has mental illness. That's why we will look at a gambit of different patterns that emerged. We look at not only, because and there's, you know, we look at, and we don't take it by itself either, but we look at the line quality, we look at the fragmentation, we look at the composition, we look at the omitted body parts. And even by itself, we don't make a conclusion. We just indicate and look at it and say, wow, it's a very expressive piece and it's gorgeous. It doesn't mean anything in and of itself. In conjunction with all the other pieces, with a combination of all the formal elements. You know, people oftentimes will ask me, what do you think about the artwork of real artists? And I always laugh because this guy's a real artist. But they mean people like Picasso or Van Gogh. And I say, well, you know, Picasso was fragmented, but he didn't have any of these other characteristics and all these other formal elements. And not to say he wasn't, and I'm not saying he wasn't problematic either. He had his personality peccadillos. You know, and people, you know, and just because you're a good artist doesn't mean it's mutually exclusive from having a mental illness either. But it's a number of different characteristics that we're looking at. This picture by in and of itself, I wouldn't testify on. So keep doing it with the negative space. I applaud it. Yes, right next to you. And what is your name? What is your name? Your name? Sarah. Sarah asked the question before, and you are?
I'm Peggy.
Hi, Peggy.
I have a question on the apple tree drawing.
Yes, we all do. No, I'm just kidding.
Did he have any other colors to pick from?
Oh, yeah.
Black?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for pointing that out, because that's the notion of prominence of color. The question was, were there other colors to choose from? There are 12 or 14 colors in that set of, these are Mr. Sketch markers. So not only is it colorful, but it smells lovely. He had, I believe it's 12 colors in the Mr. Sketch markers, 12, and he chose 4 of them, green, red, black, and brown. There's a little bit of green in the leaves on the tree. Yeah, let me point that out. Yeah, it's a little bit of green. Right, there's some green right there. That's red right there. And here he is black, and this is brown. So there's 4 colors out of the 12. So he used 1/3 of the colors. Yes? Run!
Early on, you talked about just looking at the formal elements and all the artwork.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered was that hard to just stay, and it kind of
Yes.
piggybacks on the whole, staying objective and all, but was that hard to just stay focused on the formal elements as opposed to any emotional responses that came up in the actual, or the content of it? Because I know you said it doesn't really mean much.
But that's an excellent question. Is it difficult to stay with just the formal elements rather than look at the content or the symbolic meaning or the emotional content? Short answer is yes. It's extremely hard because we're a therapist and we look at the gestalt of the image, and we look at all the characteristics. I did have the benefit of having those 2 years, right? And so I could learn to distance myself from the art. I could learn to look at it with an objective eye, and I knew that if I'm going to present this in court, all I could present on was what was empirically supported. Formal elements are empirically supported in our field. All of the characteristics, the formal elements in a drawing, have empirically researched, robust research supporting each and every one of those components to demonstrate how those combinations reflect a certain mental illness. And I can point to those references and say, this is where this says this. Although people have written anecdotally, and people have written through case vignettes about the symbolic content of an image, it does vary from person to person, and it varies from client to client, varies from culture to culture. And so there's no real handle on what a symbolic meaning could mean for a particular image. So as much as I wanted to tell the story through the narratives, I had to stay away from that. So the short answer is yeah. Good question. Just one more question. Okay. Yes, Dr. Schrader. How do you spell I-O?
You had, the luxury of having the artwork of the person before they committed the crime and after they committed the crime, and almost like a pre-test, post-test. Would you think it would be problematic to take on a case in which you did not have any artwork prior to the crime and only afterwards? I mean, would you be reluctant or hesitant to take a case in the future if you didn't have that pre-test data?
That's an excellent question. If everyone heard that clearly, right? Would I be hesitant? I would. It would be a different case altogether. If I was brought in to be an expert witness to evaluate a client as part of a team, then I would give specific assessments, and a battery of assessments, so probably more than just those 3, over a longer period of time, and use those conclusions of those assessments of where that person might be at this given moment. I wouldn't have the benefit of all of that artwork prior to or after, so it becomes an entirely different case. But I do think that an art therapist can certainly testify in court using a battery of assessments similar to this, especially since, again, the nonverbal benefits outweigh the perhaps capacity for it to be speaking not truth. Good question. Was
Please
that?
join me in thanking